March 8, 1943. North Atlantic, 520 miles southwest of Iceland. The U-boat lurched. Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann felt it through the steel deck plates beneath his boots, a tremor that ran through U-221's hull like the shiver of a dying animal. 300 feet below the surface, in absolute darkness broken only by the crimson emergency lighting, 48 men held their breath. Not figuratively. Literally held their breath, because sound was death and even breathing could betray them. The air was thick, hot, tasting of diesel oil, unwashed bodies, and something else, something metallic and sharp that Hartmann recognized as fear. Above them, somewhere in the black water, an American destroyer traced lazy circles. Waiting. Listening. And then it came, a sound like no other sound in human experience. Ping. A crystalline note, almost beautiful, piercing the ocean and the steel and the silence. Ping. The sonar pulse touched U-221's hull and bounced back, carrying with it the submarine's location, depth, speed, and the desperate truth that there was nowhere left to hide. Hartmann watched his hydrophone operator, a boy from Hamburg barely 20 years old, press his headphones tighter against his ears as if he could block out the sound. But you couldn't block out sonar. It found you. It marked you. It sentenced you. Ping. The young operator's hands began to shake. His lips moved in what might have been prayer or simply the repetition of a single word. Bit. Please. Ping. And then the sound changed. The hunter had found its prey. The pings came faster now, more insistent, and every man in that iron coffin knew what came next. The depth charges. Hartmann closed his eyes and wondered, in the seconds before the first explosion, how warfare had become this. Hunted by invisible sound, killed by science he barely understood, defeated by machines that could see in the dark with their ears. This was the war they had not been prepared to fight. To understand the existential terror that sonar represented to German U-boat crews, one must first understand what submarine warfare had been before its introduction. The U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine, rebuilt in secret during the 1930s in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, had been designed around a doctrine of invisible warfare. The submarine's greatest weapon was not its torpedoes but its ability to disappear. Surface under cover of darkness, attack, submerge, vanish. In the early years of the war, this doctrine had been devastatingly effective. During the first 2 years of the Atlantic campaign, German U-boats sank over 1,100 Allied merchant ships, more than 5 million tons of vital supplies sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war, the only campaign that made him doubt Allied victory was possible. The U-boat men called it Die Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. From June 1940 to February 1941, submarine crews returned to French ports draped in flowers, celebrated as heroes, their commanders awarded Knight's Crosses and promoted to glory. They had reason for confidence. British anti-submarine warfare was primitive, destroyers hunting submarines by sight or by listening for engine noise through crude hydrophones. A U-boat commander with nerve could dive deep, shut down his engines, and wait. The ocean was vast and dark, and sound traveled strangely through water. More often than not, the hunters gave up and steamed away, leaving the submarine to surface hours later, unharmed and ready to kill again. But by 1943, the happy time was a distant memory. Something had changed. British and American destroyers had become predators of terrifying efficiency, finding U-boats in conditions that should have made detection impossible. At night, in storms, at depths that should have provided safety. German crews began to whisper about Allied wonder weapons, about destroyers that could see through water, about magic that let the enemy hunt submarines as if they were lit by searchlights. The whispers were not quite accurate, but they were close enough. The Allies had not developed magic. They had developed something more powerful. They had perfected sonar. The science of underwater sound detection had existed, in crude form, since World War I. The basic principle was simple. Sound waves travel through water far more effectively than through air. Generate a pulse of sound, send it into the ocean, and if it strikes something solid, a submarine, a whale, a reef, it will bounce back. Measure the time between transmission and echo, and you can calculate distance. Change the angle of transmission, and you can determine direction. This was not theoretical physics. It was established science. But transforming scientific principle into a weapon that could function in the chaos of naval combat, In the unpredictable acoustic environment of the ocean, under battle conditions with crews under stress, that was the challenge. And by 1943, the Americans and British had solved it. The British called their system ASTIC, named for the Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee that had developed it. The Americans called theirs Sonar, an acronym for sound navigation and ranging. The technologies were similar, but American production capacity and innovation had pushed sonar development to levels the Germans struggled to counter. By 1943, American destroyers were being fitted with sonar systems so sophisticated they could not only detect submarines but could track them continuously, measure their depth, predict their movements, and guide depth charge attacks with precision that turned submarine hunting from an art into a science. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound and immediate. Submarine warfare had always been dangerous. These men were volunteers who understood the risks, but it had been danger with an escape route. You could dive deep, run silent, wait for the hunters to lose your trail. But sonar removed that option. Once a destroyer's sonar locked onto your hull, you were marked. You could run, but the sonar pulse would find you. You could go deep, but the sonar would follow you down. You could shut down every system, lie motionless on the ocean floor like a dead thing, and still the pings would come, relentless and patient, and the depth charges would fall until your hull cracked or your crew's nerves broke. What do you think it must have been like, hunted by a technology you couldn't fight or escape? Share your thoughts below. Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Bergen survived 4 war patrols before U-336 was sunk in May 1943. He spent the rest of the war in a Canadian POW camp, and in 1947 he gave a lengthy interview to Allied naval historians. His description of a sonar hunt remains one of the most detailed first-hand accounts we have. The first time you hear it, you think it is machinery, Bergen recalled. A mechanical sound. Artificial. You think perhaps there is damage to the boat, something wrong with the ballast pumps or the trim system. But then your hydrophone operator tells you, it is coming from outside. From above. And you understand what it means. Bergen paused in the interview, and the historian noted that he seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. The sound is very pure. Very clean. Like a bell or a tuning fork. Almost pleasant, if you did not know what it meant. But we knew. Every man on the boat knew. When you hear that sound, you are no longer a hunter. You are prey. And the worst part, the part that breaks men, is that you hear them finding you. Each ping that comes back, you know they are measuring you. Tracking you. The science is hunting you, and you have no science to hide with. Only luck. Only prayer. And those things do not work against machines. He was right. By 1943, American destroyer crews had refined sonar operation to a level of precision that seemed almost supernatural to their victims. Sonar operators, trained extensively in underwater acoustics, could distinguish between a submarine, a school of fish, a thermal layer, or a wreck on the ocean floor. They could estimate a submarine's size, speed, and heading. Most crucially, they could track a target continuously while their ship maneuvered for attack. Earlier systems had required the attacking ship to slow down to listen, creating gaps in tracking that gave submarines chances to escape. The newer American sonar systems, particularly the QC and QGA models deployed from 1942 onward, allowed destroyers to maintain contact even at attack speed. This transformed anti-submarine warfare from a game of chance into something approaching certainty. A destroyer that gained sonar contact on a U-boat had better than a 60% chance of sinking it, a dramatic reversal from 1940, when the odds favored the submarine. The statistics tell the story. In 1940, it took an average of 250 depth charges to sink one U-boat. By 1943, the number had dropped to 40. Not because the depth charges had improved dramatically, but because sonar had made it possible to know exactly where the submarine was when the charges were released. The depth charges themselves became objects of mythic terror for U-boat crews. Each charge was a drum of high explosive, typically containing 300 pounds of TNT or Torpex, designed to detonate at a preset depth. The explosion didn't need to rupture the submarine's hull directly. Water is incompressible. A shock wave in water travels with far more force than in air. A depth charge exploding within 20 feet of a submarine could buckle hull plates, shatter instruments, rupture the ballast tanks, or kill the crew through sheer concussive force without penetrating the hull at all. Closer than 10 feet, and the hull would almost certainly fail catastrophically. A coordinated depth charge attack involved multiple charges dropped in a pattern designed to cover the estimated area where the submarine might have maneuvered since the last sonar contact. American destroyers typically dropped charges in salvos of 6 to 12, set at varying depths to cover the vertical dimension as well. The sound of these explosions, transmitted through the water and through the submarine's hull, was described by survivors as beyond anything human psychology was equipped to handle. The submarine would buck and roll. Lights would shatter. Men would be thrown against bulkheads. The hull would scream. Metal under stress makes sounds that seem alive, agonized. Cork insulation would rain from the ceiling. Sometimes pipes would rupture, spraying seawater or hydraulic fluid. Sometimes men's ears would bleed from the pressure waves. And through it all, between the explosions, the sonar would continue. Asterisk ping. 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 Asterisk reminding the crew that the destroyer above knew exactly where they were, that the next salvo would be adjusted based on their attempts to evade, that there was nowhere to hide. Corvettenkapitän Peter Donitz, no relation to Admiral Karl Donitz, commanded U-178 and survived an 8-hour sonar hunt in November 1943. His war diary, recovered after his capture in 1944, describes the experience with clinical precision that gradually dissolves into something approaching psychological collapse. 1,420 hours. First sonar contact. Dove to 180 meters. 1435. Depth charges. Pattern of 8, estimated 40 meters distant. Minor damage to electrical systems. 1450. Sonar contact reacquired. Altered course to 270 degrees. 1505. Depth charges. Pattern of 10, closer this time. Flooding in aft torpedo room. 1520. Sonar contact continuous now. They are not losing us. 1540. Another attack. We are running out of battery power. If we surface, they will shell us. If we stay down, eventually the battery dies and we sink. There is no good choice. Only choices about how we die. The diary continues in this vein for pages, documenting each attack, each system failure, each decision point in a calculus of survival that offered no good options. By hour 6, Donitz's entries had become fragments. The sound. Can't stop hearing it. Even between pings. It's in my head. By hour 7, Meyer is crying. I ordered him to stop. He can't. The final entry, written after U-178 surfaced and surrendered, we are defeated. Not by men but by their machines. The machines that hear us. That hunt us with patience no human has. I think we were never meant to win this war. Do you think technology can break the human spirit more effectively than direct combat? We'd love to hear your perspective. The perfection of American sonar was not a single breakthrough but an accumulation of incremental improvements, each building on the last, each pushed forward by massive investment in research and training. The United States had entered the war with sonar technology roughly equivalent to Britain's, but American industrial capacity and scientific resources allowed for rapid iteration. The Underwater Sound Laboratory in New London, Connecticut, became the center of American sonar research, employing hundreds of scientists and engineers. They tested equipment in every conceivable ocean condition. They studied how water temperature, salinity, pressure, and the ocean floor affected sound propagation. They developed training programs that transformed ordinary sailors into acoustic specialists who could interpret the complex soundscapes of underwater warfare. This was scientific warfare on a scale the Germans could not match. Germany had excellent scientists, but they were scattered across competing military branches and industrial firms, often duplicating each other's work. Germany had limited access to testing facilities. The Baltic was too shallow and too controlled, while the Atlantic was controlled by Allied forces. Most critically, Germany lacked the industrial surplus to build sonar systems in quantity. Even if German engineers had matched American sonar technology, which they never quite did, they could not have produced enough units to equip their surface fleet. Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Bergen survived 4 war patrols before U-336 was sunk in May 1943. He spent the rest of the war in a Canadian POW camp, and in 1947 he gave a lengthy interview to Allied naval historians. His description of a sonar hunt remains one of the most detailed first-hand accounts we have. The first time you hear it, you think it is machinery, Bergen recalled. A mechanical sound. Artificial. You think perhaps there is damage to the boat, something wrong with the ballast pumps or the trim system. But then your hydrophone operator tells you it is coming from outside, from above, and you understand what it means. Bergen paused in the interview, and the historian noted that he seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. The sound is very pure, very clean, like a bell or a tuning fork. Almost pleasant, if you did not know what it meant. But we knew. Every man on the boat knew. When you hear that sound, you are no longer a hunter. You are prey. And the worst part, the part that breaks men, is that you hear them finding you. Each ping that comes back, you know they are measuring you, tracking you. The science is hunting you, and you have no science to hide with. Only luck. Only prayer. And those things do not work against machines. He was right. By 1943, American destroyer crews had refined sonar operation to a level of precision that seemed almost supernatural to their victims. Sonar operators, trained extensively in underwater acoustics, could distinguish between a submarine, a school of fish, a thermal layer, or a wreck on the ocean floor. They could estimate a submarine's size, speed, and heading. Most crucially, they could track a target continuously while their ship maneuvered for attack. Earlier systems had required the attacking ship to slow down to listen, creating gaps in tracking that gave submarines chances to escape. The newer American sonar systems, particularly the QC and QGA models deployed from 1942 onward, allowed destroyers to maintain contact even at attack speed. This transformed anti-submarine warfare from a game of chance into something approaching certainty. A destroyer that gained sonar contact on a U-boat had better than a 60% chance of sinking it, a dramatic reversal from 1940, when the odds favored the submarine. The statistics tell the story. In 1940, it took an average of 250 depth charges to sink one U-boat. By 1943, the number had dropped to 40. Not because the depth charges had improved dramatically, but because sonar had made it possible to know exactly where the submarine was when the charges were released. The depth charges themselves became objects of mythic terror for U-boat crews. Each charge was a drum of high explosive, typically containing 300 pounds of TNT or Torpex, designed to detonate at a preset depth. The explosion didn't need to rupture the submarine's hull directly. Water is incompressible. A shock wave in water travels with far more force than in air. A depth charge exploding within 20 feet of a submarine could buckle hull plates, shatter instruments, rupture the ballast tanks, or kill the crew through sheer concussive force without penetrating the hull at all. Closer than 10 feet, and the hull would almost certainly fail catastrophically. A coordinated depth charge attack involved multiple charges dropped in a pattern designed to cover the estimated area where the submarine might have maneuvered since the last sonar contact. American destroyers typically dropped charges in salvos of 6 to 12, set at varying depths to cover the vertical dimension as well. The sound of these explosions, transmitted through the water and through the submarine's hull, was described by survivors as beyond anything human psychology was equipped to handle. The submarine would buck and roll. Lights would shatter. Men would be thrown against bulkheads. The hull would scream. Metal under stress makes sounds that seem alive, agonized. Cork insulation would rain from the ceiling. Sometimes pipes would rupture, spraying seawater or hydraulic fluid. Sometimes men's ears would bleed from the pressure waves. And through it all, between the explosions, the sonar would continue. Asterisk ping. 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 Asterisk reminding the crew that the destroyer above knew exactly where they were, that the next salvo would be adjusted based on their attempts to evade, that there was nowhere to hide. Corvettenkapitän Peter Donitz, no relation to Admiral Karl Donitz, commanded U-178 and survived an 8-hour sonar hunt in November 1943. His war diary, recovered after his capture in 1944, describes the experience with clinical precision that gradually dissolves into something approaching psychological collapse. 1,420 hours. First sonar contact. Dove to 180 meters. 1435. Depth charges. Pattern of 8, estimated 40 meters distant. Minor damage to electrical systems. 1450. Sonar contact reacquired. Altered course to 270 degrees. 1505. Depth charges. Pattern of 10, closer this time. Flooding in aft torpedo room. 1520. Sonar contact continuous now. They are not losing us. 1540. Another attack. We are running out of battery power. If we surface, they will shell us. If we stay down, eventually the battery dies and we sink. There is no good choice. Only choices about how we die. The diary continues in this vein for pages, documenting each attack, each system failure, each decision point in a calculus of survival that offered no good options. By hour 6, Donut's entries had become fragments. The sound. Can't stop hearing it. Even between pings. It's in my head. By hour 7, Meyer is crying. I ordered him to stop. He can't. The final entry, written after U-178 surfaced and surrendered, we are defeated. Not by men but by their machines. The machines that hear us. That hunt us with patience no human has. I think we were never meant to win this war. Do you think technology can break the human spirit more effectively than direct combat? We'd love to hear your perspective. The perfection of American sonar was not a single breakthrough but an accumulation of incremental improvements, each building on the last, each pushed forward by massive investment in research and training. The United States had entered the war with sonar technology roughly equivalent to Britain's, but American industrial capacity and scientific resources allowed for rapid iteration. The Underwater Sound Laboratory in New London, Connecticut, became the center of American sonar research, employing hundreds of scientists and engineers. They tested equipment in every conceivable ocean condition. They studied how water temperature, salinity, pressure, and the ocean floor affected sound propagation. They developed training programs that transformed ordinary sailors into acoustic specialists who could interpret the complex soundscapes of underwater warfare. This was scientific warfare on a scale the Germans could not match. Germany had excellent scientists, but they were scattered across competing military branches and industrial firms, often duplicating each other's work. Germany had limited access to testing facilities. The Baltic was too shallow and too controlled, while the Atlantic was controlled by Allied forces. Most critically, Germany lacked the industrial surplus to build sonar systems in quantity. Even if German engineers had matched American sonar technology, which they never quite did, they could not have produced enough units to equip their surface fleet. American destroyer production had reached staggering levels by 1943. Shipyards were launching escort destroyers at a rate of multiple ships per week. Each was equipped with sonar, radar, radio direction finding, and a full suite of anti-submarine weapons. These ships were not individually superior to their German counterparts in speed or armament, but they existed in overwhelming numbers and were packed with technology that German ships could not match. A typical American destroyer in 1943 had sonar effective to 2,500 yards, radar that could detect a submarine's periscope at 5 miles, and radio equipment that allowed instant coordination with aircraft and other ships. It was not one weapon but a system of weapons, each element supporting the others. German U-boats, by contrast, were becoming technologically obsolete even as they were being built. The Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine submarine fleet, was a design that dated to the 1930s. It was reliable and well constructed, but it had been designed for a war in which submarines could hide by diving and running silent. It had no countermeasures against sonar beyond basic acoustic quieting and the hope that the crew could evade long enough for the hunter to give up. Against the sonar systems of 1943, these measures were increasingly useless. The psychological toll of sonar warfare on U-boat crews manifested in ways that German naval command struggled to address. Submariners began to exhibit what would later be recognized as symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though the term did not exist in 1943. Men returned from patrols withdrawn, hypervigilant, unable to sleep. Some reported auditory hallucinations, hearing sonar pings even when they were ashore, safe in port. Medical officers noted increasing rates of nervous breakdown, of submariners declaring themselves unfit for duty, of suicide. The German Navy, steeped in traditions of discipline and honor, had no framework for addressing psychological trauma. Men who broke down were often treated as cowards or malingerers. Some were court-martialed. Others were sent back to sea despite obvious psychological damage, because the U-boat force was bleeding experienced crewmen and needed every qualified sailor. This approach was both cruel and counterproductive. A traumatized sonar operator might freeze at a critical moment. A commander suffering from stress-induced paranoia might make erratic decisions. But the German military culture of the era permitted no acknowledgement that machines, mere machines, could break a man's spirit. Yet they could, and they did. The sonar ping became a sound that haunted men's dreams. Veterans of the U-boat service, interviewed decades after the war, would describe hearing that sound in their nightmares, waking in cold sweat with the certainty that depth charges were falling. One survivor, in a 1978 interview, described it simply: "You could face an enemy you could see. You could fight men with courage. But you cannot fight sound. You cannot shoot sound. You cannot hide from sound. It hunts you in the dark, and there is nothing you can do but wait for it to kill you. That waiting, that is what broke us." The statistics bear out this psychological collapse. U-boat crew morale, measured by intelligence assessments and POW interrogations, declined sharply starting in mid-1942 and plummeted through 1943. Captured U-boat crewmen increasingly spoke of the futility of their missions, of the certainty that each patrol would be their last. The swagger and confidence of the happy time had evaporated. In its place was grim resignation and, increasingly, relief at having been captured and thus removed from the war. What would you do if you knew every mission might be your last, hunted by something you couldn't fight? Tell us in the comments. The American destroyers that perfected sonar warfare were themselves products of industrial abundance that staggered the German imagination. The destroyer USS England, for example, sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days in May 1944, a record that stands to this day. This was not exceptional seamanship alone, though the crew was skilled. It was the marriage of technology and training. England's sonar operators could track submarines through thermal layers that should have scattered the sonar beam. They could distinguish between a submarine attempting to evade and a biological mass of fish. They could predict where a submarine would be by the time depth charges reached detonation depth, accounting for the submarine's probable evasive maneuvers. This level of expertise was not innate. It was trained. American sonar schools put operators through months of intensive instruction, including practical training in specially designed facilities where sound propagation could be studied in controlled conditions. Operators learned to read sonar returns the way a doctor reads an X-ray, distinguishing subtle patterns that indicated target type, range, and behavior. This training was expensive and time-consuming, but American could afford both. Germany could not. The technological gap widened further with American development of sonobuoys, expendable sonar devices that could be dropped from aircraft to detect submerged submarines. By 1943, Allied patrol aircraft could seed an area with sonobuoys, creating a listening network that made entire sections of the Atlantic untenable for U-boats. A submarine that dove to evade a destroyer might find itself detected by a sonobuoy dropped from a Catalina flying boat, which would radio the submarine's position to nearby surface ships. The ocean was becoming transparent to the Allies, and opaque to the Germans. Fregatten-Captain Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders, wrote in his personal journal after his boat was damaged in a sonar hunt, "We are fighting a war we cannot win with the tools we have. The enemy hears everything. We are blind and deaf by comparison. Our torpedoes miss as often as they hit. Theirs find us in the dark. Our industry builds boats slower than they are sunk. Theirs builds hunters faster than we can kill them. This is not warfare. It is industrial murder, and we are the ones being murdered." He was not alone in this assessment. German naval intelligence had recognized by early 1943 that the Battle of the Atlantic was being lost, primarily due to Allied technological superiority in detection. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat force and later commander-in-chief of the German Navy, argued vociferously for resources to develop countermeasures and new submarine designs. Some countermeasures were developed: the Aphrodite decoy, which released chemicals that created false sonar returns, and acoustic torpedoes designed to home in on the sound of destroyer propellers. But these were partial solutions to a comprehensive problem. The Allies adapted quickly, and the fundamental imbalance remained. Allied detection technology was advancing faster than German counterdetection. The sound of sonar, that pure, mechanical ping, became a symbol of Allied technological dominance in a way no weapon before it had. Unlike a shell or a torpedo, which killed through physical destruction, sonar killed through knowledge. It stripped away the submarine's primary defense, invisibility. In this, it represented a broader shift in the nature of warfare, from industrial combat to information-based combat. World War II was transitioning, in real time, from a war of mass and firepower to a war of sensors and data. The side that could see and hear the battlefield more clearly that could process information more quickly and accurately, gained decisive advantages. This shift was particularly devastating to German military culture, which lionized individual courage, tactical genius, and fighting spirit. These qualities mattered, but they mattered less and less as the war progressed. A U-boat commander of supreme skill and courage could not evade sonar through willpower. A destroyer captain of moderate ability could sink a U-boat if his sonar operators were well trained and his equipment was functioning properly. The machine was beginning to matter more than the man, a deeply uncomfortable truth for a military tradition rooted in Prussian concepts of martial honor. Survivors of U-boat service, in post-war interviews, often fixated on the impersonal nature of their defeat. They had not been outfought. They had been outsensed, outcoordinated, outproduced. "We were brave," one veteran said in a 1960 interview. "We were skilled. We were willing to die. And none of it mattered. They found us with their machines and killed us with their machines, and our bravery was irrelevant." There is profound bitterness in this statement, but also a recognition of historical truth. The U-boat force suffered a 75% casualty rate over the course of the war, 28,000 dead out of 40,000 who served. These men died not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they were fighting in submarines designed for the previous war's tactics against enemies who had invented new ways to hunt them. Do you think this represents progress, or a loss of something important in how wars are fought? Share your thoughts below. By late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively in favor of the Allies, and sonar was a primary reason why. German U-boat losses in 1943 exceeded the construction rate of new boats. Experienced crews, the ones who understood the strange acoustic environment of the ocean and had developed survival instincts through multiple patrols, were being killed faster than they could be replaced. New crews, inadequately trained due to the compression of training schedules, died even faster. The average life expectancy of a U-boat, measured from the moment it left port on its first patrol to the moment it was sunk, had dropped to approximately 2 missions by the end of 1943. Admiral Donitz, in a conference with Hitler in May 1943, argued for a temporary withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic until new technologies, specifically the Type XXI U-boat, which featured improved underwater speed and quieting, could be deployed. Hitler refused. The U-boat campaign would continue, despite the losses, because the political and strategic symbolism of surrender in the Atlantic was unacceptable. So U-boats continued to sail, and continued to die, hunted by destroyers whose sonar could find them in conditions that should have been impossible. The experience of U-515 exemplifies this terminal phase of the U-boat war. Commanded by Captain Lieutenant Werner Henke, the boat sailed from Lorient, France on October 16, 1943. Henke was an experienced commander, holder of the Knight's Cross, survivor of multiple patrols. U-515 had been refitted with the latest German acoustic countermeasures. On April 9, 1944, while operating off Madeira, U-515 was detected by the American destroyer escort USS Chatelaine. The sonar contact was gained at 2,500 yards, extreme range, but the sonar operators aboard Chatelaine were confident in their reading. They tracked the submarine for 40 minutes while maneuvering into attack position. U-515 attempted every evasion tactic in the manual: speed changes, depth changes, course alterations designed to confuse pursuers. The sonar never lost contact. Chatelaine delivered a depth charge attack with precise accuracy. U-515 was damaged but not destroyed. The submarine attempted to escape at maximum speed, burning battery power, descending to dangerous depths. The sonar followed. A second attack damaged the submarine further. Henke, recognizing that his boat was dying, made the only decision that offered his crew any chance of survival. He surfaced and surrendered. Of U-515's crew, 44 survived. Henke himself survived the war but died in American custody under disputed circumstances in 1944. His U-boat, cut open by depth charge damage, sank to the bottom of the Atlantic where it remains. This pattern repeated hundreds of times across the Atlantic. U-boats detected by sonar had few options, none good. Surface and fight, but a submarine's deck gun was no match for a destroyer's main armament. Dive deep, but the sonar could track depth changes, and depth charges could be set accordingly. Run, but destroyers were faster on the surface, and submarines' submerged speed was too slow to escape. Wait silently, but batteries would eventually die, and when the boat was forced to surface, the hunters would be waiting. The perfection of sonar was not merely a technological achievement. It represented a philosophical shift in how America approached warfare, as a problem to be solved through applied science and industrial capacity. The Manhattan Project gets more attention in histories of World War II, but the sonar program was in many ways equally representative of American warmaking. Identify a problem, in this case, how to find submarines in a vast ocean. Throw resources at it, scientists, engineers, testing facilities, production capacity. Iterate rapidly, learning from each deployment. Train personnel extensively. And scale up massively once the solution works. German industry could not compete with this approach, not because German scientists were inferior, they were not, but because Germany lacked the surplus industrial capacity to experiment and iterate. German resources were stretched across too many fronts, too many weapons programs, too many competing priorities. Every ton of steel that went into sonar research was a ton not going into tanks or submarines or aircraft. Germany was forced to choose, and those choices became increasingly desperate as the war progressed. America, by contrast, was not forced to choose in the same way. American industry could produce Liberty ships and destroyers and aircraft and tanks and sonar equipment simultaneously. The scale of American production is difficult to comprehend. In 1943 alone, American shipyards launched more than 140 destroyer escorts specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare, each equipped with cutting-edge sonar. Germany built 270 U-boats that same year, an impressive number, until you realized they were being hunted by a fleet that had grown far faster than they could sink it. This abundance, this ability to build not just weapons but entire systems of weapons, to train not just sailors but specialists, to produce not just equipment but improved versions of that equipment year after year, this was the true American advantage. The sonar was merely an expression of it. A German U-boat crewman, listening to that ping in the darkness, was hearing the sound of American industrial capacity hunting him. He was being killed not by individual Americans, but by an entire economic system that had been converted to the purpose of his destruction. What do you think? Can any amount of individual courage overcome such systemic advantage? Let us know your thoughts. The sound haunted more than just the men who heard it while submerged. Post-war studies of U-boat veterans revealed lasting psychological trauma at rates far higher than for veterans of surface warfare. The randomness of depth charge attacks, the helplessness of being hunted, the extended periods of terror punctuated by sudden violence, these created conditions ideal for producing psychological breakdown. Modern psychologists studying these cases have noted that the U-boat experience combined multiple factors known to maximize trauma: inability to fight back, lack of control, unpredictable threat, confinement, and social isolation. One psychiatrist, studying U-boat veterans in the 1970s, described their condition as the submarine disease, a specific pattern of trauma responses. The men had difficulty with enclosed spaces. They startled at sudden sounds. Many reported persistent nightmares involving water, darkness, and that specific sound, the sonar ping. Some had developed such severe responses that they could not shower. The sound of water flowing triggered panic responses. These were not weak men. They were men who had been subjected to a form of warfare that exceeded human psychology's evolved capacity to cope. The German Navy had recognized, even during the war, that something was breaking down in the U-boat force. Patrol reports from late 1943 and 1944 increasingly noted crew exhaustion, nervous strain, and in some cases outright mutiny or refusal to sail. These incidents were handled quietly. To maintain morale, such failures could not be publicized, but they pointed to a force in systemic collapse. You cannot sustain a military service with a 75% casualty rate and maintain morale. Eventually, every surviving member knows he is statistically doomed. At that point, individual courage becomes less relevant than collective despair. Admiral Donitz himself, in his memoirs written after the war, acknowledged that by 1944 he was sending men to die in a campaign that could no longer achieve its objectives. He justified this by appealing to strategic necessity, tying down Allied resources, forcing them to maintain massive anti-submarine forces. But from the perspective of the men in the submarines, listening to the sonar pings that would guide depth charges to their deaths, such strategic justifications were cold comfort. They were dying not to win, but to delay losing. The sonar ping, that mechanical sound, became in the mythology of the U-boat force what the sirens were in Greek mythology, an irresistible force drawing men to their doom. Experienced crewmen spoke of it with a kind of reverent dread. It was the sound that meant your number had come up, that luck had run out, that the ocean had chosen you. Some crews developed rituals or superstitions around it, prayers whispered when the first ping was heard, lucky charms clutched during depth charge attacks. These were educated men, many of them, trained in engineering and navigation. They knew superstition was irrational. But human beings under existential stress reach for anything that offers the illusion of control, even when they know it's an illusion. American sonar operators, for their part, developed their own relationship with the technology. For them, the ping was a tool, powerful but neutral. Some described the satisfaction of a clean return signal, the professional pride in a well-executed track. Others were more reflective about what that sound meant to the men on the receiving end. One operator, interviewed in 1945, said, "We knew we were killing men. You'd get a solid contact, track it for maybe an hour, drop your charges, and then you'd listen. Sometimes you'd hear the hull breaking up. Sometimes you'd hear the air rushing out. Those were men dying. We knew that. But it was also our job, and they'd have killed us if positions were reversed. War is like that." This matter-of-fact acknowledgement captures something important. The sonar operators were not monsters. They were technicians doing a job. The horror was not in their individual actions, but in the system that made those actions necessary. The ping was impersonal. It found submarines with mechanical efficiency, without malice or mercy. It was warfare reduced to physics and mathematics. In a sense, it was the purest expression of industrial war, killing abstracted into technical problems and solved through engineering. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the U-boat force had been effectively destroyed. Of the roughly 1,150 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 were lost, a staggering 68% loss rate. In human terms, 28,000 dead, 5,000 captured, out of 40,000 who served. These are casualty rates comparable to the most devastating battles of the war. And a significant portion of these losses can be attributed directly or indirectly to Allied sonar. The boats that were sunk by sonar-directed depth charges. The boats that were forced to surface by sonar harassment and then destroyed by gunfire or aircraft. The boats that were detected by sonar and then tracked until they could be attacked. The psychological toll that made crews less effective, more prone to mistakes, more likely to surrender when damaged rather than fight to the death. The perfection of Allied sonar did not merely sink U-boats. It ended submarine warfare as it had been practiced, forcing a fundamental reconception of how submarines could be used. Post-war submarine development, particularly the advent of nuclear-powered submarines, was in many ways a response to the sonar challenge. If you could not hide, you had to become fast enough to run. If you could not run, you had to become quiet enough that sonar could not find you. The arms race between submarine stealth and sonar detection continues to this day, each advance in one technology driving innovation in the other. But in World War II, the U-boat force had no such innovations to fall back on. They fought with submarines designed for the previous war against detection systems designed for the current one. The result was foreordained. The only question was how many men would die before German leadership acknowledged it. What do you think drives men to continue fighting when they know the cause is lost? We'd appreciate your reflections in the comments. There is a recording, preserved in the Imperial War Museum in London, of a sonar operator from HMS Starling describing a successful attack on U-202 in June 1943. The operator's voice is young, educated, calm. He describes gaining contact at 1,800 yards, tracking the target through multiple evasive maneuvers, coordinating with the ship's attack team, and finally the moment of weapons release. "We heard the detonations through the hull," he says. 4 distinct explosions. And then we heard the submarine breaking up. It's a sound you don't forget. Metal tearing under pressure. Took about 30 seconds. Then silence. We maintained sonar watch for another hour, but there was nothing. She'd gone down. He pauses, and when he continues, his tone has changed slightly. Later we recovered some debris. Life jackets, personal effects. A photograph of someone's family. That's when it hits you, really. That you've killed people. Not just sunk a boat. Killed people. Men who probably weren't much different from us. Men who had families, Who'd have rather been home? But that's war. You do what's necessary, and you live with it after. This recording is valuable because it captures both sides of the sonar war, the technical efficiency and the human cost. The operator did his job with professional competence. Men died because of that competence. Both things are true simultaneously. There is no villain in this story, except perhaps war itself. The Germans were not evil for trying to sink Allied ships, it was their military objective. The Allies were not evil for hunting U-boats, it was necessary to win the war. But the suffering was real on both sides, and the sonar ping was the sound that bridged those two realities. In the decades after the war, several U-boat commanders who survived the sonar hunts wrote memoirs or gave extensive interviews. A common theme runs through these accounts, a profound respect for the technology that defeated them, mixed with bitterness that they had been sent to fight with inadequate tools. "We were never given a chance," one commander wrote. Not really. By 1943, the technology gap was too great. We were fighting with the equivalent of swords while they had machine guns. Courage means nothing when the enemy can see you and you cannot see them. This is both true and not true. Courage did matter. It kept men fighting even when they knew they were likely to die. But courage alone could not overcome the systemic advantages the Allies had built. The sonar was merely the most visible manifestation of those advantages. Behind every sonar-equipped destroyer was a supply chain that could deliver replacement parts, trained operators, fuel, and ammunition wherever they were needed. Behind every depth charge was an industrial base producing explosives at scales Germany could not match. Behind every successful hunt was a training program that turned ordinary sailors into acoustic specialists. Germany had entered the war believing that quality, better training, better tactics, better fighting spirit, could overcome quantity. By 1943, they were learning that quality required time to develop, while quantity could be produced at industrial scale. And the Allies, particularly the Americans, had figured out how to mass-produce quality. Their sonar operators were well-trained and numerous. Their destroyers were well-built and numerous. Their depth charges were effective and numerous. At every level, the Allies had achieved what the Germans could not, the industrialization of excellence. The legacy of World War II sonar development extends far beyond the war itself. Post-war, the technology developed for hunting U-boats became the foundation for civilian applications. Fish-finding sonar for commercial fishing, depth-finding sonar for navigation, side-scan sonar for underwater mapping. The scientific understanding of underwater acoustics, pushed forward by wartime necessity, opened new fields of oceanographic research. The training programs developed for sonar operators influenced how technical skills would be taught in military contexts for generations. But the immediate legacy, in 1945, was simpler and darker, the near-complete destruction of a military force that had once seemed unstoppable. The U-boat men who survived carried with them the memory of that sound, the ping that had hunted them through dark water, the sound of science turned to the purpose of killing. For them, it remained not just a memory but a wound that never fully healed. A German veteran, interviewed in 1985, 4 decades after the war, was asked what he remembered most vividly from his service. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "The sound. That sound. I still hear it sometimes, when it's very quiet. Ping, ping, ping. It meant you were about to die, probably. And there was nothing you could do about it. Nothing at all. You just waited and hoped the charges would miss, and usually they didn't. That sound took away your power to fight back. It made you helpless. I think that's what I remember most, the helplessness. That no matter how brave you were, how skilled, how determined, you could not fight sound. You could only hide from it, and eventually it would find you anyway." That is the truth at the heart of this story. The perfection of Allied sonar represented more than a tactical victory. It represented the triumph of a certain kind of warfare, technological, systematic, based on information dominance rather than individual heroism. The U-boat crews were not defeated because they lacked courage, they had courage in abundance. They were defeated because they were fighting in an era when courage alone was no longer sufficient. The sonar ping was the sound of that new reality, cold and mechanical and inescapable. And so we return to U-221, to Captain Lieutenant Hartmann, to that moment in March 1943 when the sonar first found them and marked them for death. The depth charges came, as they always did. The submarine was damaged but not destroyed. Hartmann managed to evade, to creep away at minimal speed with batteries nearly exhausted and half his crew in shock. They survived that hunt. But 3 weeks later, on March 27, 1943, U-221 was detected again, this time by the British destroyer HMS Hesperus. The sonar locked on. The depth charges fell. This time, there was no escape. U-221 was forced to surface. 46 crewmen survived and were taken prisoner. 2 died in the initial attack. Hartmann spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in England. In a letter to his wife, written in 1946 after his release, he tried to explain what the war had been like. "We were not defeated by better men," he wrote. "We were defeated by better tools. The British and Americans had machines that could find us anywhere, and once found, we were already dead. This is what modern war has become, not a contest of courage or skill, but of science and industry. Perhaps this is better. Perhaps it is worse. I only know that the men who died under the depth charges were as brave as any men who ever lived, and their bravery bought them nothing but iron coffins at the bottom of the sea." This is the epilogue of the Sonar War. Thousands of men dying bravely in a cause that could not be won, hunted by a technology they could not counter, victims of a strategic miscalculation made years before they ever heard the first ping. The sound that haunted them was not just the sonar. It was the sound of history turning, of one kind of warfare giving way to another, of courage becoming insufficient in the face of systematic technological advantage. The ping echoes still, in the memories of those who survived and in the historical record of those who did not. It is the sound of modernity at war, efficient, impersonal, and absolutely lethal. It is the sound that German U-boat crews feared above all others, because it was the sound of being known, being tracked, being marked for death by an enemy who could see in the dark with their ears. And it is the sound that marked the end of submarine warfare as a conflict of stealth and chance, transforming it into a hunt where the hunters had every advantage and the hunted had only the hope that the machines, for once, might fail. They rarely did. What do you think this transformation in warfare means for how we understand courage and victory? Does technology diminish human agency in war, or does it simply change how human qualities matter? Share your final thoughts below. We'd love to continue this conversation about how science changed the nature of combat forever.